The war between Russia and Ukraine isn't just redrawing borders, it might be planting the seeds of an internal collapse in North Korea. Yeah, you heard that right. The country ruled with an iron fist by Kim Jong-un is feeling the direct consequences of a conflict in Europe, far from the Korean peninsula. But none of this happened by chance. This is what you get when two isolated regimes join forces not just in weapons, but also in risks that could shake the very foundations of their own power. Behind the headlines, there are quiet but dangerous moves. Young North Koreans being sent to fight on foreign soil, strategic deals hiding internal weaknesses, and a human cost their governments will never admit. The decisions being made right now aren't just about the present conflict. They could shape the fate of entire nations. They could put North Korea at risk, an immediate risk, a risk caused by Vladimir Putin and his ally, Kim Jong-un. Today, we're opening that black box and taking a close look at the inner workings of this alliance. What's the real price of keeping a long war going when the fuel is your own people? And how far are Russia and North Korea willing to go to keep this partnership alive? And to help us understand this complex scenario and its possible consequences, we have special guest Chris Turner, former Navy SEAL, bringing his experience and strategic insight to break down what this cooperation means on the battlefield and in the global geopolitical chessboard. What's happening now in Eastern Europe isn't just another chapter of war. It's a course change with global impact. North Korea's actual entry into supporting Russia has created a new dynamic, both on the front lines and in supply strategies. Chris, in your view, what were the most decisive factors behind this recent shift?
The shift was obvious. Russia reorganized its command structure and focused on targeted offensives, especially in Donbass and Kursk. The massive inflow of ammo from North Korea made it possible to ramp up bombardments, something Russia couldn't keep up before. Ukraine, on the other hand, had to deal with a shortage of Western ammo and focus on defense instead of counterattacks, which cut down its strategic reach.
So more than just territory, we're looking at a war being decided by the ability to keep supply lines going. Moscow found a way in Pyongyang to keep the offensive going, but did that actually change the pace of the fighting?
Big time. Modern wars aren't won just with brave soldiers. You need a constant flow of ammo, fuel, and spare parts. And Russia was running out of room to maneuver. North Korea stepped in like an emergency supplier, almost like an ammo outpost. But this help comes with a high political cost, because Pyongyang doesn't give anything for free, and they're using this to get favors and advanced military tech.
And that puts Moscow in a delicate spot. If half your ammo stockpile comes from one ally, any change in that relationship could be a serious blow. Do you see that dependency as a big risk for Russia?
Absolutely. It's like putting all your eggs in one basket. Without North Korea, Russia's attack tempo would drop fast, because the offensives rely directly on that ammo flow. That gives Kim Jong-un a bargaining power he's never had before, letting him influence strategic decisions in Moscow. And that influence could spill over into other areas, including diplomatic negotiations and military alliances outside the Ukraine conflict.
What stands out to me is that this partnership doesn't just hit the military front, it also shakes up energy markets, supply chains, and global investment strategies. So, it makes sense to dig deeper into the point that basically sealed this approach between the two countries.
Exactly. This war is showing that in the 21st century, the battlefield is as much economic and technological as it is geographic. North Korea is using the war to test weapons, train troops, and expand its influence. But at the same time, it's exposing vulnerabilities that could be exploited in the future, and that could cost Pyongyang dearly.
Chris, I want to talk now about the treaty signed in 2024, because it seems like that was the milestone in this alliance, and it changed how the West sees the Moscow-Pyongyang relationship. You were following that closely. What does this deal really mean?
In 2024, Russia and North Korea signed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty, a deal that many analysts see as a landmark in their relationship. Historically, these ties go back to the Cold War, but they've always been on and off. This treaty changed the game. It formalized commitments for mutual military and tech support and opened the door for large-scale shipments of ammo, weapons, and even North Korean troops. On top of that, it set a legal basis for exchanging sensitive technology like missile systems, radars, and surveillance capabilities.
And interestingly, at the same time, Moscow started offering strategic paybacks. Reports say Russia's been helping Pyongyang with space infrastructure and modernizing its weapons. Chris, that sounds a lot like how Moscow treated allied countries during the Cold War. Do you see clear parallels?
No doubt. Back then, Moscow gave military and tech support to strategic allies to expand its global influence. The difference now is that North Korea is getting access to advanced military tech, like cutting-edge air defense systems and ballistic missile engineering, boosting its deterrence power against South Korea, Japan, and the US. For Russia, it's a vital supply line, ensuring ammo, parts, and key electronic components despite Western sanctions.
But this alliance isn't just military. On the diplomatic side, signing this treaty sent a clear message to the West that Moscow's ready to seek partners willing to challenge the established order. Could this reshape strategic blocs?
For sure, the treaty puts North Korea close to priority ally status, alongside Belarus and Iran. Together, they form a tight core able to swap intel, technology, and logistical support. For Kim Jong-un, it's a chance to position himself as a central player in resisting the Western Bloc and to boost his leverage in regional negotiations.
Historically, Russia and North Korea have had military ties, especially after the Korean War and during the Cold War. Is this treaty just a continuation of that history, or does it represent something new in terms of depth and risk?
It's a bit of both. In the past, Moscow saw Pyongyang as a useful ally against US influence in the Pacific, sending weapons and training. After the Soviet collapse, that cooled off. Now we're seeing a comeback, but with way more mutual dependency. Russia needs supplies to keep the war going, and North Korea wants tech and political legitimacy. This balance is new, and it could shift the geopolitical balance in both Asia and Eastern Europe.
Given this new context, what do you see as the long-term risks for Moscow and Pyongyang if this partnership continues, or even deepens? Could you give examples of similar alliances in history that ended up bringing negative consequences for one or both sides, like Germany and Italy in World War II, or Iraq and the Soviet Union in the 80s?
Looking at the future of the Moscow-Pyongyang partnership, the first big thing that jumps out is the potential for extreme international isolation. I'm not just talking about more sanctions, I mean total diplomatic and trade lockouts. The more these two tie themselves together, the harder it gets for either to make concessions or patch things up with the West. This has happened before. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, which at first seemed to strengthen the Axis, ended up dragging each other into unwinnable war fronts, speeding up their collapse.
So even though there are immediate benefits, history shows these alliances can become a burden. But for North Korea specifically, what's the most dangerous trap?
For Pyongyang, the trap is twofold. First, committing military and human resources beyond what it can replace. In the 80s, Iraq had massive Soviet support weapons, training, technical advisors. But the war with Iran drained its resources, leaving the country economically and politically weakened. If North Korea keeps sending ammo and troops to sustain Russia, it could burn through its strategic stockpiles, hurting its ability to defend itself against South Korea and the US.
Now, on the diplomatic and image side, Chris, in a scenario where nearly half of Russia's ammo comes from a single partner, and that partner is already one of the most isolated countries in the world, how does that weigh on international perception? Doesn't this massive supply make Russia's dependence even more obvious?
No doubt. Wartime alliances shape outside perception for decades. If North Korea becomes locked in as Russia's main supplier, its pariah state image will harden. That could mean total isolation, cutting off the few trade routes it still has, and ramping up military pressure on the Korean peninsula. For Moscow, the risk is similar. By siding with a partner seen as unpredictable and hostile to the West, Russia could lose whatever neutral channels it still has with some countries.
Interesting you bring up unpredictable partners. History's full of alliances that fell apart because one side couldn't predict or control the other's actions. Could that happen here?
Yes. Just look at the Soviet-Chinese relationship in the 50s and 60s. At first, it seemed like an unbreakable partnership against the West, but ideological differences and national interests tore it apart. In Russia and North Korea's case, all it would take is a shift in strategic calculations from either Kim Jong-un or Putin for their interests to clash. And in the middle of a war like Ukraine, a crack like that could be disastrous.
And for the investors watching us, how should they read the scenario? Is there a historical pattern that helps us understand the long-term economic consequences?
There is. Big military alliances that demand heavy logistical and financial support tend to create internal economic distortions. In the Soviet Union's case, supporting allied regimes in Africa and the Middle East during the Cold War meant massive spending that brought no direct profit, and it helped sink the Soviet economy. Right now, both Russia and North Korea could be burning through strategic reserves and pulling resources away from productive sectors, which, in the medium term, means inflation, shortages, and loss of competitiveness.
So to sum it up, Chris, you're saying this alliance has the potential to shift the balance of power, but also to lock both countries into a long-term trap, right?
Exactly. In the short term, it's a win. Russia gets what it needs to keep the war going, and North Korea gets tech and prestige inside the anti-Western bloc. But history tells us alliances like this, without a clear exit plan, turn into heavy chains. Germany and Italy in World War II, Iraq, and the Soviet Union in the 80s, even the Moscow-Beijing relationship during the Cold War, they're all examples of how aligned interests in the beginning can morph into silent conflicts that eat away at the relationship from the inside.
Chris, this long-term risk analysis ties right into another key point in our conversation. You've mentioned several times Russia's dependency on North Korean ammo. So in the next segment, I want to dig into the details of how that logistics chain works. We're talking 12 million shells shipped, half of Russia's artillery stockpile coming from a single ally. That raises questions about calibers, compatibility, and battlefield impact. And of course, I want to start by understanding the real effect of that shipment in the war. Are we talking about a strategic turning point or just a temporary boost? Chris, the long-term risk analysis you just gave ties directly into another central point in our conversation. You've mentioned several times Russia's dependence on North Korean ammunition. So, in this next segment, I want to understand in detail how that logistics chain works. We're talking about 12 million shells shipped, half of Russia's artillery stockpile coming from a single ally. That raises questions about calibers, compatibility, and battlefield impact. And of course, I want to start by understanding the real effect of that shipment on the war. Are we looking at a strategic turning point or just a temporary boost?
This is definitely a strategic turning point. When you put that much ammo, especially artillery rounds, on the front lines, you're not just changing the tempo of the war, you're also forcing the enemy to change how they position themselves. Russia had been struggling to keep up constant bombardments because domestic production couldn't meet demand or maintain the rate of fire needed to pressure multiple points along the front at the same time. With this massive reinforcement, Moscow hasn't just ramped up prolonged, systematic attacks against Ukrainian defensive lines, it's also gained the freedom to run saturation operations in multiple sectors at once, wearing down Kiev's logistics, morale, and response capacity. When used well, this kind of logistical advantage can tip the balance of power in the conflict over the medium term.
But Chris, there's a technical point I think our audience should understand. Are we talking about ammo that's fully compatible with Russian systems, or does it require adaptation to be used?
For the most part, they're compatible calibers. North Korea inherited and manufactures weapons based on Soviet standards like 122mm and 152mm artillery shells, which are standard in the Russian arsenal. That makes integration a lot easier. But there are reports that some of the stock needs logistical and maintenance adjustments, mainly because the quality of the batches isn't always consistent. And here's the critical part: low-quality ammo can cause misfires, premature barrel explosions, or trajectory deviations, which compromises not just effectiveness but also troop safety. On the ground, that means Russian command has to carefully decide which units get North Korean ammo, sending the best batches to critical operations and reserving domestic or other suppliers' production for situations where reliability is crucial.
Interesting. And in terms of direct battlefield impact, having 50% of your ammo come from one ally, is that a major advantage or a major vulnerability?
It's both. The advantage is obvious. Russia keeps a steady flow of ammo and can sustain pressure on the front, which allows for greater tactical flexibility and prolonged offensives. But the vulnerability is huge and multi-layered. If for any reason a political fallout, logistical problems like blocked sea or rail routes, or even a strategic decision by Pyongyang to divert resources, that supply line is cut, Russia's firepower drops by half literally overnight. And the sudden loss of that volume could create a domino effect, disrupting coordination between fronts, weakening defensive lines, and opening gaps for Ukrainian counterattacks. In modern wars, where tempo and operational continuity are everything, this kind of overdependence is a risk that could change the course of the conflict very fast.
You've mentioned before that alliances like this can turn into traps. Here, the risk seems even more sensitive, since we're talking about an essential resource that's consumed daily. Are there examples in military history where reliance on a single supplier led to defeats or major losses?
Yes. A classic example is Egypt in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. The country relied heavily on Soviet supplies, and when Moscow slowed down deliveries, Egyptian operations lost momentum quickly. It shows that even in strong alliances, strategic priorities can shift, and that can directly impact combat capability.
Back to the present. Is this North Korean ammo just keeping Russia at its current level of attacks, or is it letting Moscow expand operations?
It's letting them expand, and that changes the war picture a lot. Without this influx from North Korea, Russia would be stuck maintaining defensive lines and running limited, localized attacks, picking targets much more carefully to save ammo. With this massive inflow, Moscow can launch simultaneous offensives in different parts of the front, sustain heavy fighting for longer stretches, and exploit weak points in Ukraine's defenses. That forces Kiev to spread resources and attention thin, creating a logistical overload for NATO, which now has to resupply multiple fronts at once. But this expansion also increases Russia's daily supply needs, making it even more dependent on that steady flow, and more vulnerable to any sudden disruption, whether technical, political, or transport-related.
Now on the diplomatic and image side, Chris, in a scenario where nearly half of Russia's ammo comes from a single partner, and that partner is already one of the most isolated countries in the world, how does that weigh on international perception? Doesn't this massive supply make Russia's dependence even more obvious?
And do these workers get any kind of training for the job, or are they just thrown in improvised roles?
So basically, this is a high-stakes game for both sides. But here's a different question. If you were in charge of an operation that depended on this supply chain, what would be your biggest concern?
Given everything we've covered, my biggest concern would be securing alternative supply routes. Relying on one ally for half your firepower is a massive strategic vulnerability. Militarily, it's like building a vital bridge for your operations and then handing someone else the keys. The moment they decide to lock it, your entire plan can fall apart.
Chris, beyond the weapons and ammo, we have confirmed reports that over 10,000 North Korean soldiers are fighting directly on the front lines alongside Russian forces. Considering what we've discussed so far, this should change the battlefield not just in numbers, but also in morale, strategy, and troop dynamics. How do you assess this presence and its impact?
The impact is significant and multi-layered. We're not talking about military advisors or support crews, these are fighters integrated directly into combat units, which boosts Russian operational capacity in key sectors. This can give Moscow extra breathing room and enable bolder maneuvers, but it also brings vulnerabilities. Cultural differences, language barriers, and different combat methods tend to create friction and sometimes reduce operational efficiency. Historically, like in the Korean War, adding foreign troops shifted the local balance in the short term, but it also exposed coordination problems and created dependencies that, in the long run, became a headache for Central Command.
And in terms of morale, both for the Russians and the Ukrainians, what's the most visible effect?
For Russia, it's a symbol of international support even if it's from an isolated ally and that feeds their resisting the West narrative. For Ukrainians, it's a reminder that Moscow isn't alone and that new reinforcements can show up anytime. That psychological factor weighs on them, just like in the Vietnam War, when North Vietnamese troops got reinforcements from Laos and Cambodia.
But could this foreign presence create tension with Russian soldiers?
It could, yes. Integrating different forces is a huge challenge. In the 1980s Afghan War, for example, Soviet forces fought alongside local militias with different priorities, which led to friction and command failures. Today, if Pyongyang starts pushing its own strategies, we could see serious coordination problems with Moscow. That could lead to misaligned operations, wasted resources, friendly fire risks, and even openings for the enemy to exploit. In extreme cases, these disagreements could spark internal command disputes, weakening the joint forces' cohesion and hurting Moscow's credibility with both allies and adversaries.
But beyond that, is there a risk that these soldiers will be used for higher-risk missions to preserve Russian forces?
Yes, that's a real possibility. In long wars, it's common for foreign troops to be sent into the most dangerous fights. That can raise internal tensions, but it also cuts domestic casualties.
And how does Ukraine see the arrival of foreign fighters?
For Kiev, it's a clear sign that Moscow is willing to further internationalize the war. This pushes Western allies to step up military support and gives Ukraine an argument to push for more advanced weapons. It also strengthens the idea that Ukraine could bring in more foreign fighters of its own either through international brigades or special forces quietly sent by allied countries, creating a tit-for-tat escalation in outside involvement.
So, we can say the numerical gain comes with a strategic cost?
Exactly. It's a reinforcement that boosts combat capacity but also raises operational complexity. Without effective integration, the risks can outweigh the benefits.
Chris, this issue of human reinforcements makes me think of another point. Besides soldiers, there's information about thousands of North Korean workers being sent to Russia, employed in construction, and the weapons industry in conditions considered almost slave-like. How does this support Russia's war economy?
For Moscow, this labor force means freeing up Russian workers for the front and cutting costs in strategic sectors. For Pyongyang, it's a way to get badly needed foreign currency, and contrary to what many think, there's evidence this isn't informal. There's likely a formal agreement between Russia and North Korea to send these workers, possibly backed by diplomatic channels and economic cooperation clauses. But the ethical price is massive. We're talking serious human rights violations, which put both countries in the global spotlight. Something similar happened in World War II, when millions of forced laborers were used by Nazi Germany, creating deep impacts not just on the economy but also on the global reputation of the nations involved.
Chris, from a geopolitical response standpoint, could this practice trigger new sanctions?
Without a doubt. Forced labor is universally condemned, and this could further isolate both countries. For investors and governments, it's a big red flag showing disregard for international norms.
And do these workers get any kind of training for the job, or are they just thrown in improvised roles?
Sure, in a long conflict, we usually see three main phases: the high-intensity phase, where speed of advance and volume of fire decide immediate gains. Then there's the stabilization phase, when lines settle and logistics become critical. And finally, the attrition phase, where economic weight, technology, and the ability to replace losses determine who keeps the initiative. In World War II, for example, Germany struggled when it couldn't transition effectively from blitzkrieg to the long grind imposed by the Allies. In Vietnam, the US dominated the high-intensity phase but lost steam in the attrition phase. Russia is trying to balance these cycles by using what each ally can offer at the right moment to avoid repeating other great powers' historical mistakes.
Historically, was this kind of practice sustainable for long?
No. Even in World War II, regimes that used forced labor faced drops in productivity and internal resistance problems. In the short term, it can work, but in the long run, it tends to create instability. Plus, the West sees this practice in an extremely negative light. That's why we can expect international organizations and Ukraine's allies to use this argument to push for more sanctions, pressuring the West to tighten diplomatic isolation against both countries.
Speaking of pressure and technology, I want to get into a topic that directly touches military intelligence. Chris, I want to talk a bit about the modernization of North Korea's Soe space base, with Russian support, that really caught global attention. Officially, it's for peaceful purposes, but we know space and military technology go hand in hand. What are the risks and gains of this cooperation?
The risk is that this base could be used to launch military reconnaissance satellites and secure communications systems, significantly boosting North Korea's espionage, strategic data gathering, and command capabilities. For Moscow, it means a more capable partner with greater tactical autonomy, but also one that's more independent and potentially more assertive in pursuing its own goals. As a former Navy SEAL, I see this mix of capabilities creating a scenario where Pyongyang could act more independently in future crises, using the intelligence it collects to make its own calls, not always in line with Russian interests, which could cause friction and even reshape alliances in the region.
And how does that affect the intelligence balance in the region?
Spy satellites give Pyongyang the ability to track adversaries' troop movements, predict offensives, and better coordinate joint operations with Russia. It's similar to what happened in the Cold War, when the USSR helped Cuba set up surveillance systems that changed the strategic balance in the Caribbean.
Can this kind of technology be used beyond direct military operations?
Absolutely. Satellites can also support cyber attacks, political surveillance, and even industrial espionage, creating an influence network that stretches into economic and strategic areas far beyond the battlefield. That means, for example, Pyongyang and Moscow could map critical supply chains, monitor rival nations' ports and industrial activity, and even anticipate defense-related financial movements. The range of applications goes way beyond combat. Strategically, it can offer a competitive edge not just in war, but in the race for resources and global influence.
So basically, we're looking at a mutual strengthening that could go far beyond the Ukraine war?
No doubt. This kind of infrastructure doesn't just vanish after a conflict, and its strategic value tends to grow over time. In the current war, it could give Russia and North Korea a constant monitoring edge, predicting Ukrainian and Western moves with more precision and speed. In the future, that same setup could be used as a bargaining chip in multilateral talks, as leverage for alliances, or as a subtle threat in regional disputes. Also, by building an independent data gathering and transmission network, Moscow and Pyongyang cut their exposure to Western surveillance and increased their influence over the Asia-Pacific and Eastern European balance of power, changing how neighboring powers adjust their defense and diplomacy strategies. And the more advanced the satellite and communications network becomes, the harder it is to intercept data and predict moves. It's a cat-and-mouse game, and now there's another well-equipped player in it.
Chris, after everything we've talked about regarding North Korea, here's the question. When we look at the current scenario between North Korea, Iran, and China, which of these allies is most important for Russia right now? And more than that, how does each one contribute in a unique way?
Each ally brings a different package of benefits and challenges. North Korea delivers mass and volume, mostly in ammo, and now in combat troops. Iran supplies drone technology, missiles, and expertise in asymmetric warfare. And China offers economic and diplomatic backing that no other ally can match. plus advanced tech across multiple sectors. Even though each one's importance changes depending on the war's phase, if we look at the big picture and consider the quality of what each partner brings, China stands out as Moscow's most valuable asset. That's because its support isn't just about volume or one-off deliveries, it's structural. It can keep Russia's war machine running continuously, with high-grade components, strategic investments, and diplomatic influence that reduces Moscow's isolation. By comparison, North Korea and Iran are important pieces, but much more replaceable in terms of long-term strategic impact.
Interesting. And if we think about direct battlefield impact, who's making the biggest difference right now?
In the short term, North Korea. Sending millions of shells and thousands of soldiers directly affects Moscow's ability to sustain offensive operations. But as I said, for long-term sustainability, China becomes the central pillar, keeping Russia's economy breathing under sanctions.
And where does Iran fit into this equation?
Iran has been key in supplying kamikaze drones and missile systems, which put pressure on Ukraine's infrastructure and test Western air defenses. It's a more targeted kind of support, but with real psychological and operational impact. Historically, there are parallels with North Vietnam's alliances, where they received military and tech aid from both the Soviet Union and China.
You mentioned different phases of the war. Can you break that down?
Sure. In a long conflict, we usually see three main phases: the high-intensity phase, where speed of advance and volume of fire decide immediate gains. Then there's the stabilization phase, when lines settle and logistics become critical. And finally, the attrition phase, where economic weight, technology, and the ability to replace losses determine who keeps the initiative. In World War II, for example, Germany struggled when it couldn't transition effectively from blitzkrieg to the long grind imposed by the Allies. In Vietnam, the US dominated the high-intensity phase but lost steam in the attrition phase. Russia is trying to balance these cycles by using what each ally can offer at the right moment to avoid repeating other great powers' historical mistakes.
Both. They limit formal trade but push the growth of gray markets and smuggling networks, which can be extremely profitable for those operating in them. Historically, long wars have always created these parallel circuits.
Yes, North Korea, Iran, and China are not a cohesive bloc like NATO. Each has its own strategic goals. Beijing, for example, doesn't want an open clash with the West, while Pyongyang is looking to maximize military gains. That forces Moscow into a delicate diplomatic balancing act.
To wrap this part up, looking at the medium term, which of these allies do you think could actually redefine the geopolitical balance if the conflict keeps going?
If the war drags on, China will be the decisive factor. It has the economic scale, technological capacity, and diplomatic weight to influence not just the fighting, but also peace negotiations. Without Beijing, Moscow would have a hard time keeping its position both militarily and globally.
Great point. And speaking of global influence, I want to go beyond alliances and look at the diplomatic chess game happening behind the scenes. Chris, we recently saw Putin call Kim Jong-un just before the Russian president met with Donald Trump. That raises a lot of questions about indirect messages and influence plays. How do you read that move?
That call was loaded with symbolism. It was a message to multiple audiences, to the West, that Moscow has allies ready to align quickly, to Pyongyang, that Russia values the partnership, and to Trump, as a way to show Putin is active in building relationships outside the traditional sphere. In diplomacy, the timing of a contact can be just as important as its content.
And how does that fit into the global chessboard?
We're watching Moscow try to maximize influence by crossing agendas. By talking to Kim before Trump, Putin creates the impression he's moving pieces on multiple boards in East Asia and in the Western sphere and can use one front to gain leverage on the other. We've seen this before during the Cold War, when Soviet leaders alternated between courting third world countries and negotiating with the US.
But in your opinion, do you see any specific hidden message in this gesture?
Yes, it could carry an implicit deterrent message. If the US pushes too hard, Moscow and Pyongyang might deepen their military cooperation. At the same time, it could be a way to gauge Trump's position before the official meeting, using Kim as an informal go-between.
So we're talking about diplomacy as a chessboard?
Exactly. Every move is designed to influence multiple players. This triangulation between Russia, North Korea, and the United States is risky, but it can yield tactical gains if played right. If it works, Moscow could gain more ability to pressure Washington on multiple fronts, using Pyongyang as a bargaining chip in talks and creating a deterrent effect by showing it has allies ready for coordinated action. On the flip side, the consequences could be heavy. One wrong step could trigger simultaneous reactions from the US and its allies, speed up multilateral sanctions, and even spark a regional military escalation. It's a high-stakes game where every piece moved shifts the strategic balance.
And how does this impact Russia's allies and adversaries?
Allies tend to tighten bonds, seeing Moscow as a player that doesn't isolate itself. Adversaries, on the other hand, may increase sanctions or step up support for Ukraine to cancel out any advantage Moscow might get from this diplomatic network.
Interesting. And that brings me right to my next point. How does all this play out in the markets and investments? Chris, this expanded alliance and these diplomatic moves inevitably affect economic sectors. How do you see this influence in defense, energy, and technology markets?
In defense, higher demand for weapons boosts the industry and raises the stock prices of companies tied to the military complex. In energy, Russia is trying to get around sanctions by selling oil and gas to alternative markets, shifting trade routes and creating opportunities for middlemen. In tech, we're seeing a rush for components and know-how that could benefit suppliers outside the Western sphere.
And what about sanctions? Do they really limit trade, or do they create new parallel markets?
Both. They limit formal trade but push the growth of gray markets and smuggling networks, which can be extremely profitable for those operating in them. Historically, long wars have always created these parallel circuits.
Do you see any parallel between today's scenario and other moments in history that shook markets?
Yes. In the Gulf War, for example, certain sectors boomed while others collapsed. Today, the effect is broader because this war touches entire global supply chains, especially in energy and semiconductors.
So for sharp investors, there are both risks and opportunities?
Exactly. Anyone who understands the geopolitical risk map can avoid losses or even profit from sudden shifts. But it's a dangerous game, because any military escalation can wipe out gains in an instant.
Chris, I want to shift focus now to a sensitive point, the deployment of thousands of North Korean soldiers to Russia. We know that over 10,000 fighters have been sent, but what do we know about who they are and what they thought they were going to do?
A lot of these soldiers were told back home that they'd be on training missions, guarding strategic facilities, or doing logistical support. The pitch was that it would be an honorable, safe mission sold as a prestigious patriotic duty. Some thought they'd spend weeks in well-structured camps, far from real danger. But the moment they set foot in Russia, that illusion shattered. They were rushed straight to devastated sectors of Ukraine, where the smell of gunpowder and the constant thunder of artillery replaced any idea of a quiet routine. For many, that first contact with the front was a brutal shock, freezing nights in makeshift trenches, combat they weren't physically or mentally prepared for.
Given that reality shock you've just described, Chris, who exactly are these men Pyongyang is sending? What's the profile of these fighters?
Most are young soldiers from regular units, with limited experience, mixed in with a few veterans from special forces. That uneven mix affects performance, creates command challenges, and drives up the casualty rate.
Chris, speaking of losses, do we have any estimates?
Unofficial reports say losses have already topped 30% of the initial contingent, meaning thousands of young men aren't coming home. That includes those killed, seriously wounded, and missing, many whose bodies will never be recovered. The North Korean government keeps those numbers under absolute secrecy, but intelligence sources say the human cost is devastating. Entire communities are losing a generation, and in some villages, almost every family has a direct relative on the front or has already lost one. This drain of human capital isn't just a military statistic, it's an open wound in North Korea's social fabric.
And for North Korea, Chris, could losing so many young men cause internal problems? I'm talking about demographic impacts that could spill over into the economy or even domestic politics.
No doubt. The sudden loss of thousands of working-age young men creates a demographic hole that can hit the workforce, cut agricultural and industrial output, and, in the medium term, put extra pressure on the country's already struggling economy. Politically, the regime tries to spin these losses into propaganda capital, but the social cost runs deep, whole communities lose potential leaders, and the prolonged absence of these young men weakens family ties and social cohesion. Add to that the perception that many were misled about their mission, and you have a dangerous point of friction for Pyongyang.
Given that demographic vacuum and the economic and social impacts you've mentioned, Chris, what are the most likely internal consequences of this decision for North Korea?
North Korea tries to smother the story completely, controlling state media, restricting communications, and even holding closed-door funerals to keep images and accounts from spreading. Even so, through soldiers' families and underground networks, the stories leak. And even with tight censorship, rumors circulate, fueling resentment among families and communities. The loss of working-age men hits the local economy and breeds bitterness, especially in already impoverished areas. On top of that, the belief that soldiers were lied to about their mission erodes trust in the regime, creating silent cracks in public support.
Considering this whole picture of human losses, internal tensions in North Korea, and the challenges of managing foreign troops, for Russia, What's the real gain and the most serious risks in this partnership?
The immediate gain is more boots on the ground and the ability to sustain operations in key sectors. But this kind of cooperation opens the door to less visible risks, like leaks of sensitive information or even Russian military tech to the North Korean army. If tactical manuals, comms systems, or combat procedures end up in Pyongyang's hands, they can be copied, adapted, or even sold to third parties, shifting the regional balance. And there's still the classic risk: poor integration, cultural and strategic differences, and the political fallout if losses become unbearable for Pyongyang.
So bottom line, this is a high-cost alliance for both sides?
Absolutely. Moscow gets a tactical boost, but inherits the complexity of managing foreign troops. Pyongyang gets support in hard currency, but pays a steep price in lives and internal stability. If casualties keep piling up at this rate, we'll see more serious political consequences in North Korea in the medium term.
Chris, we've talked a lot about North Korea's losses, but we can't ignore that Russia is also facing a serious problem in this regard. Thousands of young men have died at the front, and many others have fled the country to dodge the draft. How is this affecting Russia's demographic structure?
Russia's getting hit with a double blow that's rippling across multiple fronts. On one side, there's the direct loss of working-age young men in combat, already in the hundreds of thousands since the war began, which drastically shrinks the military recruitment pool. On the other, there's a silent exodus of skilled citizens, engineers, scientists, doctors, entrepreneurs, who've left the country to avoid being drafted. This creates a vacuum not just militarily, but economically and intellectually, eroding productive capacity and innovation. Militarily, fewer young men means a weaker ability to replenish forces for long campaigns. Economically, the talent drain slows growth and scares off foreign investment. Politically, this demographic weakening can spark internal instability, open space for power struggles, and shrink Russia's international influence in the medium and long term.
And with that reflection, we wrap up today's episode. Thanks, Chris, for being here and for the depth of your analysis. And to you listening, stay sharp. The geopolitical chessboard changes fast, and we'll be here to break down every move.
Yes, just look at what happened to some European nations after World War I. France, for example, lost a huge share of its young male population, which cut its labor force and slowed its economic recovery. Another example is Poland during World War II. Deep population loss combined with a brain drain that hurt reconstruction for decades.
In Russia's case, what's the long-term risk?
The risk is deep and multi-layered. Fewer young people means a smaller future draft pool, weaker innovation capacity, and more pressure on the pension system, fewer workers supporting a growing elderly population. In a war scenario, that means fewer soldiers to keep long-term operations going, and fewer engineers, technicians, and scientists to keep the military and industrial machine running. Politically, a country facing this kind of decline can see its internal stability threatened by social tensions and power struggles. On top of that, losing a big chunk of your intellectual and technical elite makes you less competitive globally, and when you add the military drain, it can reshape your geopolitical role, opening the door for rivals and shrinking your ability to influence global events.
And how does the war make this worse?
War doesn't just kill or drive out young people, it also kills birth rates. Economic uncertainty, social instability, and fear of the future make families delay or abandon plans to have kids. That creates a cycle. Fewer young people today means fewer adults tomorrow, and the trend can sustain itself.
Do you think this could push Russia to a demographic point of no return?
If the war drags on and the exodus continues, yes. We've seen empires collapse in part because of demographic issues. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, lost cohesion and the ability to maintain itself due to wars, economic crises, and population decline. For Moscow, the challenge will be huge. Replacing this lost human capital will take decades, and even with a military victory, it could mean internal weakness in the future.
So in the end, both Russia and North Korea are paying a huge demographic price for this war.
Exactly. And the most worrying part is, unlike material resources, human lives can't be replaced quickly. Every young person lost or driven away is a piece of the future that's gone for good.
Chris, after all this overview of losses, alliances, and internal consequences, what's your projection for the next year of war? Are we closer to escalation or to negotiations?
In the short term, I see little chance of a lasting ceasefire. The trend is toward controlled escalation, something like we saw in the Korean War in the 1950s. With constant advances and retreats but no final resolution. We can expect local gains combined with heavier logistical pressure on both sides. Moscow believes it can hold out until political and economic fatigue hits the West, echoing the Soviet World War II strategy of wearing down the enemy through prolonged resistance. Kiev, meanwhile, is betting on more military and financial aid, a bit like how US help to the UK before formally entering World War II kept Britain in the fight.
And where does North Korea fit into this board going forward?
Pyongyang will keep supplying ammo and will likely boost troop presence, but will also use the war to negotiate perks with Moscow, like tech access and political backing against sanctions.
Do you see any realistic scenario for a negotiating table in 2026?
Only if there's a major turning point, either a Russian logistical collapse, a serious political crisis in Kiev, or strong international pressure from major powers pushing both sides to stop. We're talking about game-changing events, like when public opinion and global pressure forced a US pullout in Vietnam. In today's situation, without that kind of trigger, the most likely outcome is a drawn-out war of attrition, with each side trying to outlast the other and millions of people stuck living under the uncertainty and weight of a conflict with no clear end in sight.
And for the investors and geopolitical analysts listening to us, what's the key point to watch?
Keep an eye on Russia's economic resilience, its ability to replace military equipment, and the diplomatic moves of China and Iran. Those factors will shape the pace and length of the conflict.
Chris, after all this analysis, what would be your final message to our listeners?
You got me there. I'd say wars aren't just about maps and stats. Behind every strategic move, there are lives being shaped or destroyed. Understanding the conflict means understanding the people in it and the consequences that will follow, even for those far from the battlefield.
And with that reflection, we wrap up today's episode. Thanks, Chris, for being here and for the depth of your analysis. And to you listening, stay sharp. The geopolitical chessboard changes fast, and we'll be here to break down every move. And if you want to keep getting the best videos on global geopolitics, covering all the most important military events, subscribe to the channel, because it exists for just one reason: to keep you well-informed, free from the manipulation of the mainstream media. Helping you become a well-informed person is my mission. In the video now showing on your screen, I reveal how Vladimir Putin is close to facing a demographic collapse in Russia. Click on the screen and check it out.